Welcome to the Bytes of Intelligence Podcast, hosted at Imperial College London. My name is Yash, and this podcast is where we explore the journeys of inspiring individuals shaping our world. Today, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Amar Shah joining us. Dr. Shah is a visionary entrepreneur and machine learning expert who has revolutionized multiple fields with his innovative thinking. Are you okay if I call you Amar?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So Amar's journey started with an undergraduate degree in maths and a Ph.D. in machine learning from Cambridge University. Since then, he has identified challenges and created groundbreaking solutions as an entrepreneur. Specifically, Amar was a co-founder and CEO of Wayve, a leading company providing a unique approach to self-driving technology. Unlike traditional autonomous vehicle companies that rely heavily on complex sensor systems and pre-programmed rules and maps, Wayve's embodied AI approach learns to drive much like a human would. Wayve went on to raise funding in Europe's largest ever AI funding round, and it all started in 2017 with Amar and his co-founder Alex Kendall. What truly inspires me about Amar specifically is his relentless pursuit of innovation, always thinking about how you can revolutionize real-world problems across diverse domains. From Wayve, Amar co-founded CHARM Therapeutics, a company pioneering drug discovery and protein co-folding. I don't understand too much about it just yet, but hopefully we'll jump into that in the podcast. For me, Amar exemplifies the dream we all share, to use our expertise to one day make a tangible difference in the world. It's honestly an honor to have an opportunity to speak to you today and have a glimpse into your mind. Welcome and thank you for joining.
Thank you very much for such a kind welcome. I'm very happy to share some of my experiences and hope many people will learn and do great things themselves off the back of it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I guess we'll just start a little bit briefly about, your childhood, your upbringing, and kind of how you started university and how you got into Wayve. Would you mind just speaking to me a little bit about, you started, so where you grew up and why you decided to study maths at Cambridge initially, and anything in particular that you thought was really useful about maths and computer science, perhaps, that you chose that over medicine or any other fields from an early age?
Sure. So I grew up in northwest London in a borough called Harrow, which is heavily populated with Indian immigrants, particularly from East Africa, which is where my parents were born. This community was very hardworking, thrived for independence, and highly prioritized education of children to facilitate their independence in future life. So schooling was incredibly valued and something that I and many of my cousins and neighbors aspired to do well in. So was very fortunate to have had such an upbringing with relative abundance of, say, shelter and food. A lot of the premise was there for a success. It was pretty quickly apparent that science was what drew me. I loved physics, chemistry, biology, but not as much, but more than everything else, mathematics. And when it came to doing A-levels, many people with that interest thought that studying medicine was the best way to go because it provided this secure career. It was highly prestigious in a community which had valued education. And so that was quite a compelling argument. However, I could not really relinquish my interest in mathematics. And despite not having a clear pathway for career, I just felt at that age of 17, 18, it was too early to commit to a lifelong career in anything, especially with such little experience in life. And I thought mathematics would keep many doors open without closing too many, and would be something that I would enjoy more. So it was a decision to embrace the uncertainty of where my life would go for the sake of learning and enjoyment, and I'm pretty glad I took that path.
Brilliant. I think I can share many of those kind of initial ideas because I initially thought maybe I could be a doctor, maybe I could do law, but I think in the end I really loved maths and I thought computer science kind of complements that and I can tap into many of the different industries with the skill set of bringing in technology. So I really, appreciate that. And I think that many people, even at Imperial or other universities who study these subjects, really share that same idea of how can we apply computer science or mathematics to certain domains. And I think you're the ideal example of how you can apply to diverse domains. Please could you kind of talk a little bit about any qualities or traits that maybe you had when you were slightly younger to do with problem solving, and were you always looking out for that next business opportunity or where a problem is, and is there a solution to this, or did it kind of just develop as you went through university? Was there anything that your parents did perhaps that might have changed the way you thought, and are there any things that parents can do to teach their kids? So just anything about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure that I can think straight away of any parental decisions, but I can speak to where I noticed my curiosity brewing, which may shine a light of how I've pursued projects going forward. Essentially, an observation I've had from a young age is that the most interesting innovations come at the intersection of ecosystems. This is true in nature, where you see the proliferation of life at the boundaries of land and water, or forest and fields, and you have the most interesting emergence and evolution of new biologies even. And I felt this was probably the case in innovation and science. And so the idea of applying mathematical and physics-based concepts to real-world problems, I think, was something that interested me from a young age. And I felt that having a foundation in something like mathematics, computer science, or physics gives you a tool set to go and address real-world problems elsewhere. And kind of ironically, what may end up being the case, especially with CHARM, is that with that knowledge, we may end up saving more lives with developing drugs with this computer science technology than if I had become a medical doctor, because the leverage of mathematics and computer science is so high. I'm not making a statement that one is better than the other, because nothing can really beat that one-on-one experience you have in personally saving some individual's life. But it's just an interesting way to frame how you can create value in different ways. And I think this is a concept I understood having seen, for example, the rise of the internet, and eventually how mobile phone connectivity can expand your user base across the world almost overnight. And so I think these were the ideas that made me think about how can I access a big group of people with any work I end up doing.
That's really interesting, because, you know, when I thought about that decision of studying computer science, there was always that thought at the back of my mind saying, how can I genuinely make a difference if I'm studying algorithms or I'm proving formulas all day? How can I actually affect lives as a doctor would, because they're physically, treating someone? But I think what you specifically said about that kind of domain and the vast population you can affect through one specific company is really interesting, or research, because technology has the power to access every corner of the world. If you look at, for example, Instagram or Facebook, for example, people in every country across the world will have heard of this, whereas someone like an incredibly good doctor, for example, might be really specific to a certain domain. So I find that really interesting. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about, your university degree and how that shaped you, because obviously many people find that university degrees nowadays are getting slightly less useful perhaps, and maybe apprenticeships or just going straight into the job might be more useful. But did you find that the training that mathematics at Cambridge gave you really helped build your problem solving skills? Was that kind of something people just say? And do you have any thoughts on university degrees nowadays?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've thought about this quite a lot, and it's a little bit embarrassing that I probably use exactly 0 of the theorems that I've learned throughout those 3 or 4 years. Actually, there's one that I do think about regularly, but most of them I don't. But having said that, I think viewing that process as learning to learn, I believe, is the right way to look at specifically a mathematics degree, probably similar for physics and computer science. And when you graduate at 21, 22, and you have your whole life ahead of you, you can now go into the world and dissect any new problem with your analytical rigor that has been basically created through that process. So it is true that sometimes the content of what you learn isn't directly useful in the world, but it's really about the process of how did you dissect the problems and learn how to replicate that framework going forward in your life. And I still think that at that age it was probably the right thing to be focused on.
Okay.
In the absence of going for an apprenticeship or a specific vocation like plumbing or electrician, where perhaps a different method makes sense. So I think that it's about managing the expectations of what a degree should give you. And based on that, you can judge its usefulness.
Okay, great. And while we're on the topic of university, I wanted to ask if you had multiple people, multiple friends at university who are on the same wavelength as you, because sometimes, there's that saying that the 5 people you surround yourself with are the people you kind of become. I was wondering, at Cambridge or throughout your university life, did you always surround yourself with people who are always thinking of, this is a problem, can we solve this? Or was it mainly just that was kind of your own aspiration?
Frankly, I think that was not the case. If anything, the opposite.
Okay.
What I noticed, this might be a bit of a generalization, but a trend I noticed is that the types of people who go to places like Cambridge, probably Imperial and Oxford too, are so used to following a ladder that's prescribed for them, getting the best grades, and they almost feel like an obligation to fit a narrative that's sometimes imposed by others. And so what I found at university was the dearth of interesting novel ideas. People followed the trend of going into particular industries, legal profession, financial professions, and generally reputable industries. The idea of going and pursuing something novel had this apparent risk associated with it. It's the first time in many of these people's lives where there wasn't a clear direction or score you could get in an exam. And I think people feared failure, perhaps even more than someone who assumed they had nothing to lose. And so actually, and I, by the way, was a victim, or a culprit, you should say, of this, and did end up going to a job in finance, not even necessarily because that was my dream, but that is what I saw happen before me. And the institutions I was at had an abundance of financial firms marketing at the careers fairs, far beyond any others at the time. Perhaps today that would look slightly different, dominated by tech firms. And so at that age, there wasn't really much exposure to anything else, and the people who worked at those firms seemed to have the best houses and cars and lives. And so I think, funnily enough, as an undergraduate, I don't think I saw the breadth of what society had to offer. And this is what changed when I went back to grad school. I felt I was a little older, maybe a little bit wiser, and able to expand my horizon better. So I think that was a good step for me personally, to go back to be in exploration mode for a bit longer.
That's really interesting. And I think what you said about, every time you look around, everyone's doing these certain things, such as applying for the internships in finance institutions or quantitative trading. So you kind of think that if the smartest person in my year group is doing that, maybe I should just follow that same path. And I think maybe I've also fallen into that same trap. But I think what might be useful to all the listeners is, could you talk me through how you actually detach yourself from that? Because obviously you joined Goldman Sachs and you stayed there, I think, for a year or two, was it? But what made you take that leap of faith and actually decide that this might not be the right path for me, and maybe I could be classed as a failure, but I should take that risk? Because sometimes it seems really scary, and why would you leave a comfy life where you're earning money to take this risk?
Yeah, so I think this was a process that grew gradually I was there for 2 years. Initially, I felt like I was learning so much about how the mechanics of the financial world works and how companies fund themselves and end up raising capital and redistributing it, and that was quite valuable to learn about at an international scale. What I got jaded by was not feeling inspired by the lives of my superiors. Whilst they were wealthy in a bank balance sense, I think they had made sacrifices that I didn't deem worth making with their family life and friendships and maybe even general health. And I think people hear about the success stories, but very rarely do you see what was sacrificed to get there. And when you're on the inside, you can start getting glimpses of that and how it can corrupt your moral compass and your value system. And I think that was challenging for me. Another concept I realized was, I think many people go into work with a zero-sum mindset. You are trying to gain, potentially at the expense of someone else. And what I think some entrepreneurs have been very successful in doing, especially in the US, is this mentality of growing the pie for everyone. So trying to avoid playing zero-sum games. That typically can happen when you innovate and create novel technologies which allow things to be possible that were never done before, and hence creating new markets. So you're actually improving the pie for everyone, rather than, for example, what you can argue in high frequency trading is you're just betting against a counterparty at their expense. You're trying to win.
And someone loses, someone wins.
Yes, and I think this is a very fundamental shift that happened in myself. And now everything I pursue in my life, I try to avoid zero-sum games. And I think trying to think about increasing the value for society, your team, your family, and yourself in combination is a good thing to do. And I just felt at the time the best tool one could use to do that is to start a company with novel innovations. And hopefully attaining customers who pay you for it and you make a profit because they are creating value for themselves. And ideally you keep an extra slice beyond what it costs you to make it. That just felt like a compelling version of ideally free market capitalism that can create prosperity for all. And so I think I just got latched on to this notion that that's something I wanted to do. You talk about risk, and I think this is something I've talked previously about, that whilst it was uncertain where that path would go, I never classified it as a risk because I didn't have anything to lose. Maybe some years of my life, but with the education I'd had, I was confident any firm would give me some form of decent job, even if that company didn't go well. And so it felt like very limited downside risk, but with a lot of potential upside benefit. And so I think viewing it as a risk is actually a misconception and a conflation of what it actually is, which was, uncertainty. And so that rationalization helped me to almost feel no option but to go for it.
That's really interesting. And I think I like how you redefined risk as it's actually not a risk. It's more of an opportunity with a minor risk where you can always go back to a company if it didn't work out.
Yeah, well, risk is defined as having something to lose. And if you're raising investors' money, of course, you don't want to throw it away. But personally, you're not really at risk, especially in a country which is a welfare state, and it's highly unlikely you'd end up on the street or without food or shelter. So that's why at many levels the risk was limited. By the way, this is a massive privilege, I should point out. This is not true in most countries.
Right.
And so that is one of the major benefits of being in a society like ours. And I felt almost a duty to shoot for the moon in exchange for that privilege.
That's amazing. I wanted to touch a little bit before we move on to actually Wayve and CHARM, a little bit just on your PhD. And I read that your supervisors were both experts. I think I might be pronouncing his name wrong, but I think Professor Zubin Gaharami and Professor Yoshua Bengio, which I think the second professor was a Turing Award, so equivalent of the Nobel Prize winner for computer science. I wanted to ask, what was your PhD about in a high-level sense and how it led to Wayve? And secondly, how, as a student, did you make the most of learning from these, some of the world's most incredible scientists? Because I feel like personally for me, at Imperial, at Cambridge, at Oxford, at all these institutions, which we're lucky to have in the UK, we have such incredible professors, but I feel like I don't get the chance to make the most of that time and learn from them other than the set curriculum. So during your PhD, how did you actually learn from them? And could you just explain a little bit about your PhD, please?
Sure. So I'll first talk a bit about the state of machine learning, and then I'll talk about the professors. So I started the PhD in 2012. I barely really knew what machine learning meant. I'd actually emailed a prior professor of mine from my master's, whose course I really loved, and asked if he took PhD students. He said he didn't, but he referred me to Zubin and said, this machine learning thing is basically what we were doing, so you'll like it. That was the only program I applied to. I was working at Goldman at the time, so didn't have a lot of capacity to look around, and I missed Cambridge, so it was either that or nothing. And luckily I got the spot. And that year, 2012, when I started, was the first year in which an NVIDIA GPU card was used to train a neural network. So when I went into the program, the idea was to pursue something called Bayesian non-parametric learning. So focus on things like Gaussian processes, which are very elegant tools with a Bayesian philosophy of learning and have a lot of strengths. And so a lot of my early work focused on these types of tools. But pretty soon after I started, I saw the formation of OpenAI. I saw DeepMind creating massive teams and having an arms race for students and GPUs. And then you start seeing things like Atari being played by neural networks within DeepMind and all sorts of incredible technologies that were essentially fueled by neural networks and end-to-end training. So the lab in Cambridge, whilst world-class and incredible, were not the quickest to embrace some of these technologies, and I started getting a little bit of FOMO. And so I actually wrote to Joshua and asked if I could spend some time with him. And I was going to Montreal for a conference anyway to present a paper, and asked if I could stay for 6 months there. And surprisingly, he did a short interview and said yes. And part of the reason I wanted to do that was to try some projects in learning deep learning. At the time, that lab in Montreal started this language called Piano, which was an API over Python, and now actually is become part of the TensorFlow setup. So that was one of the first great languages to actually code neural networks in. So I wanted to go there to learn that and work with people on this. I got incredibly lucky because Joshua's students are incredibly sought after by big tech and all sorts of firms. And in the summer, they all go off to do internships. Joshua was still coming into the office. And so I was there at that time, and he really liked the project we were working on. And so there was a phase of about 8 weeks where he would come to my desk every day.
Oh, wow.
And talk about some results for, even if it was 5 to 10 minutes. He does a very good job of being accessible, but we got very lucky in that particular moment, he had capacity because it was kind of the summer holidays. He didn't have teaching responsibilities. His students were away. So unfortunately, I don't know how you guys can replicate that, but I guess a learning is try to spend meaningful time with people in their downtimes or when they're not inundated. That's what I would do if, I'm not saying I planned this, it was completely luck-based.
You just got that personal connection by chance.
Yeah. And the project we ended up publishing was, I would say theoretically really elegant, but not very practical, and quickly got trumped by things like transformers, but still was enough to kind of influence a role I did at NASA in Mountain View the year after to apply neural networks to drones.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And essentially at that time, I really thought that this thinking ability that neural networks are giving computers was the unlock for robotics. And so at that time, going back to my prior philosophy of going to the boundaries of fields, I really thought robotics plus AI was the right thing at that time. And so this project with drones was fun. And that's when we came back and thought about, with Alex, working on drones and AI. He had also in parallel done a separate project at a startup called Skydeo on drones. And we both liked working on drones with AI, and we're thinking about this. But we quickly realized that at the time, the only commercial opportunities seemed to be in defense technologies, which didn't really excite either of us. But this is where the interest in robotics and AI kind of emerged.
Okay, brilliant. And could you just speak a little bit about, the idea of you spoke about you left Goldman to start this PhD, but you mentioned that it wasn't a risk then because it was either there's an incredible upside, or there's a small chance that you might have to join another company again. But in your mind, when you left Goldman, was there always that idea of I want to start a company, or was it purely just I want to research this quite theoretical PhD topic, and perhaps if something leads from it, that might happen, or was it just a purely I want to learn more about my subject?
I think I went in with a range of possible outcomes, including, by the way, the idea of potentially becoming an academic. Mm-hmm. That was not out of the question. I think I was holding multiple plausible paths at once, which I think is a good way to live. It's kind of a very Bayesian approach to life. At the time, I thought the chance of a startup was decent. Okay. I thought going to like a quant trading firm was decent. Academia was decent. And maybe a long tail of other very low likelihood things. And I think this perhaps peaked in the distribution peaked probably a little bit more every year that went along. And when I started the PhD, I don't think anyone in the world, let alone myself, had an idea of what a massive wave was about to emerge with AI. And as that became more and more apparent, it just seemed more and more obvious that this is potentially a once-in-a-lifetime moment where you are slightly ahead of the curve in potentially what is the biggest technology shift in human history.
Okay.
And when you really let that idea sink in, there almost was no choice. Like, there was no choice but to embrace that. And so I went in with relatively open mind, and then the world kind of spoke and called out for more AI people to build companies. So that's how I kind of parse what happened.
That's incredible. And did that wave of AI kind of inspire you to call your company Wayve? Was that nothing to do with it?
It's pretty close, actually. Yes. So, funnily enough, Alex and I were literally swimming in the sea in Sicily one summer, 2017, and kind of deciding to start the company. We'd been talking about it for months, but then we really viewed what was about to happen in AI, particularly specifically with robotics, but it's happened with all of AI, as a massive wave of change. And we were not limiting that vision just to cars at the time.
Okay.
We really believed there was going to be a wave of robotics and embodied intelligence, I suppose, which is why we just decided, let's call this Wayve.
That's amazing. Okay, so I just wanted to now reach Wayve and the kind of that brink of you have now decided with Alex, your co-founder, that you wanted to start this company. I wanted to touch on the autonomous driving industry. So at that time, I think Tesla was still alive as a company, was still developing. So of course, this industry is highly competitive. And for someone unaware of exactly what embodied AI is and what makes Wayve different, please could you just touch on why you decided that you as two PhD students could actually break into this highly competitive industry, and what makes what made Wayve a bit different to the other companies out there, please?
Sure. So at the time, we didn't have this philosophy of embodied AI. So what was prevailing at the time, this is 2016, 17, was a technology that revolved around something called SLAM, which is simultaneous localization and mapping, which was incredible technology developed in the early 2000s. and underpinned the winning projects of this DARPA competition. And there was a DARPA autonomous driving competition in the early 2000s. The motivation behind it was to find ways for vehicles to navigate minefields in battlegrounds without humans in it, because that's where a lot of fatalities were coming from,
right?
Around the Iraq wartime, for example. And so this competition was won by a team from Stanford, whose team was called Stanley. And Larry and Sergey from Google said, why don't we try this on the roads with cars? And so they essentially bought out this team and essentially piggybacked off this prevailing technology at the time. This was, in the mid-2000s. So by 2016, they'd already been doing this for over a decade. And we had noticed very little marginal progress in the recent past. So this is what we had been seeing in the industry, even from at the start of our PhD. So it wasn't incredibly compelling to us. In 2016, we were at a conference in New York and read about a fatality of a Tesla autopilot car.
Okay.
And when we studied at least what was publicly announced about it, we found that it was likely that the vehicle confidently and incorrectly identified some object in the road. And we then thought about the concept of driving and how, when we were at the conference and met people working on autonomous driving, a lot of the discourse was on saying, oh, look how good our pedestrian detector is. We're detecting 99.9% of pedestrians in this really complicated scene. But when you think about it as a human, that's not a very useful metric. In fact, I would argue what humans do very well is deciding what to ignore. And they focus on a very small subset of what's going on, which influences their driving. In parallel, we saw these Atari games being played with neural networks. And again, you can play, for example, the Pong game, only focusing on a few pixels. And what that algorithm had learned is how to compress the image to the few areas that you need to look at to play the game well.
Right.
And that's really where the whole intelligence was, which is different from identifying the state of every pixel and what it is representing.
I see.
So we realized that actually what makes humans good at driving is our compression ability. And if you modularize an algorithm to do multiple parts and stitch them together, how do you even define what it means to do scene understanding well?
Right.
Should you care about the building pixels? What about the trees? What about the sky? How do you get that information of what to focus on?
Yeah, and what to ignore.
Yes. The only way you can is if the driving system and the perception system are communicating. And that's possible by training them jointly, not separately. So there was evidence that this was the right approach in neighboring areas, like in playing Atari games or translating texts or all sorts of things. And we thought, why not in driving a car? And actually, if you take an algorithm which inputs pixels and outputs driving commands trained jointly, you are basically quickly learning how to compress that representation. And so philosophically, it just seemed like a no-brainer to us at the time. And then we thought, why aren't Google or others doing this? It's so obvious to us. And we realized there's a little bit of a conflict of interest, because if you were the team that was hired in the mid-2000s, whose career was built on SLAM, are you going to go and tell Larry and Sergey, by the way, we think you should fire us and hire people who can do X, Y, Z, because that's the way to go? And so I think that created potentially a little bit of lethargy in some of the larger institutions. They had too high sunk costs and commitments to these other methods. This is our opinion, by the way. This is completely my opinion. And because they were making small progress every year, perhaps they wanted to keep investing in that. And so it's not to say they were less smart than us or anything like that. If anything, we knew that they were incredibly capable people, but they were just barking down the wrong tree, in our opinion. And at that time, whilst neural networks and computer vision was okay but not great, we saw what was going on around us with OpenAI DeepMind, and we started seeing these scaling laws. As you increase data and compute, look at your performance gains.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we got lucky in the timing that we started at just the point where this was starting to be shown to work. And in the last 7-8 years, we have benefited from the scaling laws.
Right.
And so, whilst it wasn't good enough at the time, we thought if we can convince people over a decade, we'll keep showing better results.
Mm-hmm.
What we didn't know is if this would take 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. And to be honest, that's still a little bit unknown. Having said that, there's evidence as of the last few months that we're getting to a point where this is really possible to put on the road, as evidenced by Waymo's progress in San Francisco.
Okay, that's really exciting, because I just wanted to touch on that last part about, I think Tesla and Elon Musk specifically, for the last few years, I said it's coming this year, it's coming next year, for the full autonomy in self-driving. So I was wondering, in your opinion, do you really think that it might come on the roads like it has for Waymo, but do you think it will be really taken up and used by everyone, or do you think there'll still be that aspect of people won't trust the idea of someone else taking control of the car and everyone in an autonomous car?
I think the proof is now in the pudding. Like, Waymo have already taken a very large share of Uber and Lyft's rides in San Francisco. Most people I meet, once they've tried it once, they don't even want to go back to human-driven cars.
Right.
So I think once people experience the service and are comfortable with it, they'll be very quick to shift over, especially because in the long run, the costs will be significantly lower.
Okay. And do you think, safety-wise, it is actually better for humankind to trust these computer systems if everyone is using an autonomous car?
I think when we get to a world where all cars are autonomous, they will almost surely be safer. I think the challenge will be the transition. Mm-hmm. If all cars are autonomous and connected, they can talk to each other better than we can today. So we'll almost guarantee never having accidents. The challenge is when you have partially human and partially robot-driven vehicles, because they don't really understand how each other think. And so I think the transition will be a challenge, but in the limit, there should be a much safer, better way to get around.
Okay. And finally, just on this autonomous car point, so obviously there's many companies across the world, so whether it's Waymo, Wayve, Tesla, as well as some companies in China. Nowadays, have all of them come to a common solution similar to your approach, or are they still loads of different avenues they're all trying? For example, is Waymo and Wayve's approach similar nowadays, or are they different?
I think there is some convergence going on. The probably most meaningful differences for companies like Tesla and Wayve versus, say, Waymo and Aurora is the use of mapping and LiDAR.
Okay.
Other than that, I think there will be quite a high level of convergence. That binary difference is important because 3D maps, whilst have a lot of use, they also can be a limitation because they need to be maintained everywhere that you would like the vehicle to operate.
Right.
And that is a very difficult thing to maintain over time.
Yeah.
Because changes to road layouts can happen pretty frequently.
It's hard to scale up as well.
Yeah, and so going to any new city has a large fixed upfront cost.
Mm.
And this is what the bet for teams like Wayve or even Tesla are, that we can scale from 10 cities to 100 way quicker than anyone else.
And a lower cost as well.
And a much lower cost. And so, it's unclear how the market will be shared.
Okay.
But there's significant progress, mostly in the US and China.
Okay.
And other than those, probably Wayve is the only contender right now.
Okay, we'll come on to that in just a moment about, the Britain versus US, China and all of that approach. But I just wanted to move quickly on to the pivot from Wayve to CHARM. If you could touch a little bit on that, because obviously you've spent 3-4 years at Wayve really growing this company. And then I think what everyone would love to hear about is how you went from autonomous driving and you've gone really far deep into this area, and now you've decided to pivot into healthcare and how you actually got into that. I think I remember you saying that you were learning courses on the side on your time off on biology and protein folding. I find that really incredible for someone at your level who's already got a company to kind of learn and keep learning, and something that we could take away as students, because we might be studying our degrees right now, but is there something we can do on the side that kind of puts us into these verticals and helps us learn? So if you could talk about that transition period and starting CHARM, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, sure. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the nicest premise, in the sense that I got very sick in 2019 and was hospitalized for 2 months and had almost a near-death experience. And,
I'm sorry to hear.
Yeah, this was a big challenge. I subsequently did go back to Wayve for several months, but never really reached peak performance, and decided, sort of in a prophylactic sense, to slow down my involvement and part ways, which wasn't really what I had intended, but I thought it was the good thing for myself and the company at the time. And so, unfortunately, shortly after that, we had the COVID lockdowns, and I had time and restlessness, even though I was meant to be resting. So I thought, what can I do? Sat at home. And one thing I thought was, well, I personally had challenges with medication. I had lots of side effects and intolerances. I was rotating antibiotic combinations every couple of months, and it was really frustrating. And I got this sense that my doctors didn't really understand what was going on. I didn't blame them, to be fair, but I did think, okay, I want to learn about how medicines worked. And so I think that drove my initial curiosity. In parallel to that, at the time, there was a lot of investment going on into AI-based drug discovery. So I read about companies in the US, Recursion Therapeutics, Atomwise, and others that were raising significant amounts of money to apply end-to-end deep learning methods to chemicals and small molecules and all sorts of things like this. So I got quite curious. I did sign up to an MIT undergraduate biology course. I just took a few modules, mostly to learn about how proteins work and how DNA, RNA work and how they code our body's functions. Also at the time, there was an mRNA vaccine being developed in the UK that ended up being arguably a lifesaver for many people. So I just thought this was a fascinating thing to learn about at that time as well. And in that process, what I did was speak to people in my network who were working in the intersection of AI and drug discovery, just to see what was going on, like what types of methods and science could help accelerate innovation. And through a massive sequence of people, I came across somebody who was pretty young, was very ambitious, and ended up being quite inspired by the story of Wayve, and that it was possible straight out of university. And perhaps I kind of encouraged him that could have been him. And he, for some reason, believed me, and we decided to start coding a little bit together. And at the time, shortly after we started working together, DeepMind published something called AlphaFold 2.
Oh, wow. So you're just before that.
Just before that. And we read about it and thought, wow, this almost has solved a 50-year-old problem in biology. And we realized that kind of technology, combined with some of the things we were thinking about, could form the basis of a very exciting way to do drug discovery with protein folding based AI. So essentially, we started writing code for it, and before we knew it, people wanted to throw money at this, rightly or wrongly. I mean, this was 2021, where capital markets were very loose and interest rates were low. And off the back of our experience, people wanted to bet on us. And I think the moral of this was, for me and hopefully for the audience, is if you're interested in something, go and find great people to complement your skill set, or from whom you can learn and who can also learn from you, and think about a common goal that you have and pursue it. And I just think living life this way is very exciting. It's almost like going back to university every few years through starting companies with people you like. And yeah, inspiring each other to aim big. And so I still, to this day, don't have very significant knowledge in biology or drug discovery, but I think just laying that thought in someone's mind and showing them what's possible was probably my major contribution, and probably very little else than that. But that can be very valuable.
That's really interesting, because sometimes you think for you to start a company in a certain field, you need to be the expert in that field. Because I remember reading that, I think this Professor David Baker, who's in the CHARM team, I think he was recently awarded a Nobel Prize in Chemistry. So firstly, that's amazing to have him on your team. But secondly, that's the kind of person who I would think, they're at the top of their field, and now they can think about starting really a drug discovery company. But I think what you're saying is finding the right people and using your skill set to speak to people is actually one of the key ways you can innovate.
Yes, and I think what I found an incredible lesson throughout both of these stories is the power of a clear, compelling vision. I think when you have clarity and a vision and mission that's compelling, it compounds. People want to join it. You see this in society again and again. I think Mahatma Gandhi had this. He had a very simple premise of non-violent protest. We've also seen it in people we may not necessarily agree with, like Donald Trump or even Adolf Hitler. Whether you agree with their morals or not, it's undeniable that their simple, clear message was compelling to many people. And so this is something I've been often amazed by who you can attract into your vision, if it's compelling and clear enough. And so it's probably the main thing I would recommend trying to get right from the beginning. And it has a really incredible snowballing effect when conveyed correctly.
That's really interesting. I now wanted to move and shift the podcast a bit more towards the higher level and the global picture of companies and your vision of how you've started and run companies, as well as your opinions on how to run countries and anything of that sort. The first question I just had was, from what I've heard, it seems as though running a company is similar to running a small country, in the sense that you've got to think about so many different avenues. You've got the leadership, you've got the innovation, but you also have to manage expectations. Could you just talk a little bit about that side of whether you agree with that idea and how you dealt with that and any lessons you might have learned?
Yes, it probably has a lot of analogies. I guess I think about two stories that have been coming up for me in the last few years, but particularly in the recent months. There's one story that I think is worth sharing, and I'm kind of shocked more people in school didn't learn about this, which is probably the largest rise in human prosperity in history, which was in China between 1980 and 2020. So Deng Xiaoping was the head of the Communist Party and inherited a very impoverished China, and he wanted to do something about it. He went and learned from others, particularly Singapore, about how to create wealth and reduce poverty in his country. He did a few things which were remarkable. He reignited an old tradition in China to have written exams. This time, rather than analyze your intelligence about Confucius philosophy, he wanted to test people's scientific and economic knowledge. So he invited anyone in the party between the ages of 25 to 35 to sit a test. 20 million people wrote this test, and they picked the top 40. Each of these 40 members were given a remit to manage a district of China with free rein. He said, you have freedom to do what you want. You have two objectives. One is to double GDP per capita within 5 years, and the other is to halve infant mortality in that time. We don't know how to do it. You have to figure it out. And if you have made no progress in 6 months, you'll be ejected and replaced. They repeated this process 8 times, so 8 slots of 5 years, and this created the largest increase in wealth, a rise from the lower to the middle class, reduction in poverty in thousands of years of human history.
Wow.
So some lessons that I think you can learn from this is you, first of all, embrace meritocracy. You try to really empower your best people and align them on a vision. In their case, they had these metrics of GDP per capita and infant mortality. You really devolve power to other people. So you don't centralize power, you give people free rein, but accountability. If they do badly, you get rid of them. and you do these parallel experiments, and so you can learn from each other.
Right.
So this was really eye-opening for me. If you now look at the UK in the similar period, what do we have? We have very centralized power. All decisions are made in Westminster. Sometimes young civil servants make decisions about what should happen in Liverpool and Newcastle, having potentially never stepped foot there.
Mm-hmm.
So the power is too centralized. We have, arguably, do not have meritocracy anymore. We have a House in Parliament which is unelected and has permanent terms. We don't have plurality of thought. 75% plus of our prime ministers have gone to Oxford or Cambridge. And we perhaps don't have alignment. Ministers who are from different parts of the UK, rather than represent the constituencies, are playing a game to climb the elite social ladder in Westminster. And we have a lot of bureaucracy and red tape. To build new houses is very hard and almost impossible with so much greenbelt land. To embrace technologies and novel forms of energy is very complicated. For example, micronuclear reactors, which are so successful in France. So we don't have the same... We clearly haven't learned from the successes of other countries, which I think reflects badly on the country. I think we have a little bit of egotistical behavior and arrogance about learning from others. Mm-hmm. We may not like many policies in a place like China or Russia, but they definitely have things we should learn from.
Right.
So I guess to summarize, my blueprint for having a successful company is, first of all, to start with a compelling vision and mission, which is concise and hopefully will be compounding. You then need to assemble a team abundant with excellence, prioritizing plurality of thought, which is not the same as diversity of gender and race and ethnicity. I think in society we have focused too much on that type of diversity and not enough on plurality of experience. And so next, I think you should devolve power to smart people.
Okay.
Hardworking people who are ambitious, they like responsibility, but it has to come with accountability. Mm-hmm. So giving your team responsibility and what you expect from them is very valuable. I would say in Wayve and CHARM, I probably understand 10% of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And that's only possible because we have people far better than me at their particular roles who have had the ability to run with their ideas as long as it's aligned to our main vision. And finally, you need to have feedback loops. So you need to praise great behaviors, and you also have to cull bad behaviors. And I use behaviors specifically rather than outcomes, because an experimental failure is not necessarily a bad outcome. You need to fail, quote unquote, once or twice to learn. And people like Elon have proved this with SpaceX.
Right.
We needed some failed rockets to now have the incredible technologies that they have today.
Okay.
So you have to be cautious to not get too attached to conflating somebody's capabilities with the outcomes of their experiments, with their actual effort in their role. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you have this combination of tools, somebody like me who knows very little about a range of technologies has been able to make a difference in them by creating the right governance and setup mm-hmm. and vision. And so for me, this is the blueprint of doing grand vision companies.
That's really interesting. And I wanted to just kind of draw a little bit into, so you mentioned about UK and kind of the idea of that the innovation is stagnating a little bit. And I wanted to ask about how that impacted Wayve or CHARM, and anything that, if you had to speak to the government and you had to kind of recommend what could you learn from these other companies and what they could change to allow innovation to be a lot easier for entrepreneurs hopefully like us in the future at Imperial or at any of these institutions, what would you change?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say innovation has stagnated, especially at the university level. I think it's as good as ever.
Mm-hmm.
Where we have generally struggled traditionally, and I don't think this is a new problem, is turning that innovation into real commercial outcomes for the country. A lot of the American companies tend to capitalize on innovations wherever they come from in the world. And I think there is a bit of a cultural element to it. In studying investments within the UK, a very small fraction of funding goes to things like startup innovation or small business loans. There isn't as much what's called risk capital in the UK versus the US. A big majority of UK pension fund capital is actually going out of the UK. So maybe some basic things we can do is to have policies that encourage capital, which there is in the UK, to stay in the UK and to invest into more uncertain projects, many of which will fail, but there will be a few exceptions which will pay for many of the failures, plus more, ideally. And this is a philosophy that I think has been proven in the US for a lot longer, which has created a virtuous cycle where capital is willing to be put at risk in search of the next great things, whether it's like lately things like OpenAI. That was only possible because the investors who supported that have seen this happen before. And we haven't yet. So I think this is part of the challenge, and maybe stories like Wayve and others will start that domino effect.
I want to ask a little bit about. So I've been looking into this book called The Chip War. I think it's by Chris Miller. And as an overall idea, that book for me painted a picture that. So it was talking about the semiconductor industry and how that actually became a geopolitical background, and how countries like China and Japan were having semiconductor fights with US and other countries. And I wanted to ask about how countries and companies can work together to kind of drive the country forward. So it's more about you can utilize the power of innovation in a company such as Wayve, but how you can work with the government to actually lead the country in a positive direction. And if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's very topical, and in fact, even a company like Wayve is considered something to be in the bucket of national defense. That's the kind of technology it is deemed to be. And for example, when getting investment from certain countries, you have to go through all of these kind of processes, government processes, to assess whether there is a national security risk. And so I think there's a clear military incentive for governments to be wary of technology. So I think there is that angle, but probably the more interesting one is how to increase productivity of the workforce. And I think the big challenge now is this sentiment that AI may replace the workforce. And I think big missing piece, which perhaps nobody has really figured out, is what will the role of an individual be in a society where people are not deriving their value or purpose through employment. And I think this is a big challenge where the world will have to get together and decide how humans should act in a world that we seem to be approaching, where even highly skilled people are not really employed in a workforce. And I think that's a big theme that I would like governments and corporations or society to have engagement on. People like Elon Musk and others strongly believe that we will have a form of universal basic income. Because AIs and robots will be just doing so much of the labor that we've historically...
Kind of the mundane things, which...
Yes. But not even just mundane things, like even what we would today call highly skilled work. Including software engineering and legal advice and accounting, and even doctors could be majority replaced with AI agents. And so I think this is going to be a big question for society within the next few decades.
That does sound quite scary and ominous, but what are your personal thoughts on that? Do you think that AI, because obviously there's that common question of will AI take over my job? And there's some people on one side who say, no, it will create more jobs just as the Industrial Revolution created more jobs in the long term. So obviously in the short term, it might be that there'll be people who lose their jobs. But do you think that in the long term, AI will create more jobs? But I'm struggling to see where they might create jobs if everything's going to be taken over.
I think the notion of job will change, and arguably it's already happening. Like many people today make a career about entertaining each other through TikTok channels, Instagram channels, content creation. These were not traditionally, real jobs.
Yeah.
But they have almost come in a world where we don't need as many people in labor in the traditional sense. For example, in the Industrial Revolution, we did need people with hands and legs to operate machines. And so this is a modern trend, but arguably the job has become entertaining each other or informing each other. And that's why we somewhat have a war for attention right now, because people have attention to give in the absence of hard labor in a coal mine or in a factory. And so we don't call it a job, but arguably this is already happening, and we're just replacing traditional work with a new form of work. I don't know if people will be happier or not. That's a massive question. Films like Wall-E were very interesting to me, which showed a society where, these humans are getting overweight through eating so much fast food in their little pods, consuming media all day. That didn't look like a great life. But hopefully we won't have that situation. But yeah, I think this is a big question for society. What will we value in the absence of day-to-day labor?
Okay, great. Before we kind of end the podcast, I want to touch on two main topics. One was about you as a personal entrepreneur and your life about that. And secondly, a bit more specific, maybe advice to someone who's starting, who's in education right now, who's looking at the next big thing in AI. So I'll start on the second part, actually. So many people might think that, AI is commonly used everywhere. You've got OpenAI, you've got companies like Wayve. There's quite a lot of hype going on right now. But could it be that all of the solutions in AI are already taken? And if you're an entrepreneur now, or if you're a student who wants to start a business, what would you look into and how would you focus on the right problem?
Yeah, it does seem like that because it's in the news all day and we hear about new things emerging every few hours. Having said that, I think there is a huge backlog of necessary technologies that need to be invented that they could be pretty niche. They don't have to be niche. I think you're right that it's kind of hard to compete with fundamental research when you have entities with $1 trillion market cap, so many assets. But there will always be niche areas where people can contribute, and I would probably fall back on trying to, my personal approach is to find intersections of fields where you're not going to have as much competition. So there might be very specific applications in the medical sector or in the legal sector or something that you may have interest in, which will probably have a smaller pool of people who can put together a team who have knowledge of both technology and the vertical. And there is a combinatorial explosion of intersections. So that's what I would try to focus on, exploring a niche that interests you, that you think creates value in the world.
And how would you kind of learn? So let's say you've found a certain intersection you wanted to explore. What would you recommend to a student or someone at university to do to actually kind of start a company, or actually, because obviously you want to start coding, but you don't know what to learn, what to actually do? Would it be a case of going on these online courses and trying to learn, or what would you recommend?
I'm kind of going to assume that people have some technical knowledge and can code and know something about AI. What I really think is a bigger issue, and perhaps something university students are not used to, is going and finding the right problems.
Okay.
And actually, rather than taking a hammer and looking for a nail, you find a problem and then figure out the right solution to it. And in my experience, the best way is to speak to people who are, been in that field. What do they do day to day? What's the hardest part about their job? What would they wish they could change? By the way, going back to my China analogy, when these 40 bright people were asked to do these things, they didn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
So what did they do? They went to hospitals. They saw what is causing infant mortality. Why are kids dying young? And then they figure out solutions based on this, and they communicate with each other. And this isn't limited to university students. I'm in the process of starting something new, and even I'm doing this process, going out and speaking to people in the field and understanding their lived experience. And then you form a thesis of, okay, this is a common recurring theme of a problem in this sector. I like it. I think I can solve it. And then find people who want to do it with you. Try things as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible. Show some form of progress that people like it. And then if it's compelling enough, go and show people about it and say they should give you money to do more of it. I think that's how I would run the process. So yeah, for me, it focuses a lot on learning through people's lived experience. As university students, you probably don't have a decade of industry experience or experience in any particular thing. So you have to use or leverage others' experience to get there. And yeah, I would definitely suggest focusing on the problem before prescribing a solution. Actually, I think this is something that Y Combinator say as well, that the biggest reason startups fail is the founders hypothesize what people want.
Okay.
And end up realizing the customers actually didn't like the product.
Right.
So actually you should focus a lot more on whoever your end customer is before even building anything.
Okay. Really interesting. I wanted to speak about the life of an entrepreneur and a founder, because I think, especially from someone on the outside, they look at an entrepreneur or a successful founder like yourself or Alex Kendall and say, wow, that's incredible. I'd love to be that person one day. But there's obviously many things behind the scene that you don't really hear about, you don't see on the LinkedIn page, for example. So I wanted to ask if you ever dealt with burnout or failure, and how you kind of approach that, because you also mentioned that many PhD students or university students at these institutions are scared of that notion of failing. And I wanted to ask if you have any things that you did to deal with them. Maybe it's meditation, maybe it's spirituality, or anything at all, how you kind of dealt with these failure and burnouts, hard situations.
Yeah, definitely was a victim of burnout for sure, and arguably it's what accelerated the illness when I had it, and affected my immunity, for example. At the time, I think for me, I think this was a very big kick in the butt, and I'm quite happy I got it early, and I think I've become a lot better since. And it's challenging to achieve, but I do think having some form of balance in your life is valuable. And so what I've recently noticed is, having invested more time in let's say, commercial activities like reading novels, drawing, writing poetry, I've noticed how it's improved my creativity, which has rubbed off in my actual work. Mm-hmm. And so what I think I learned is, even though your LinkedIn page doesn't show some of these aspects of your quote-unquote success, I think you need to create a personal objective function for yourself. Humans are very good, and as our neural networks, good at optimizing any objective function that you give it. And I think the trap that many young people I find fall into is only valuing their grades or very, very limited metrics. So I think it's important you create your own loss function, which includes your health, okay, your actual physical health, your social health, like your friendships and family and all that. And you try to give it a literal weighting somehow. It's quite hard to do this, and maybe a bit nerdy in a way, but even if it's not an objective quantitative function. I think you should, and I actually do this every year. Instead of doing what like a New Year's resolution, I really try to reweigh my priorities and try to check in on them on a regular basis. And I think this is a good way to, once you set your life principles or philosophy, rather than, you just keep track of that objective function over time. And so I think when you start the company or any project in your life, you should prescribe to yourself and maybe even your co-founder or your partner, these are the things I value. I'm going to try to do all of these things together. And just one simple example of something I now do, which has been kind of valuable, bit weird. Some people find this strange, but I actually use my calendar to mark my social activities and my work activities. It's a useful thing to do, mostly because I know when I can meet someone, because I know my work calendar and my personal calendar all come through one platform. And I actually look at the end of every month, like what fraction of time was I meeting my friends or in the gym or, whatever the activity is. And I just have a quick look and see, am I happy with that balance? And if not, the next month I slightly iterate. And so I think especially computer science type people and mathematicians actually are very good at that process and probably do it in our coding.
Yeah.
And so I think we should leverage that skill in our lives more generally. And as long as that distribution is in line with your prescribed values of what you value in your life, I think that helps you to mitigate risks of over-focusing on one thing at the expense of the other.
I really love that. I love how you kind of manage your calendar as a neural network would, of like kind of iterating, finding the loss function and improving that every month. I find that really interesting. The last question I just had on the spirituality side was, do you meditate and does that help you, or was anything else that you look into? I think you mentioned that in Jainism there's some kind of themes that you look into, Anekantavad, the multiplicity of viewpoints. And is there anything that kind of translates to your work life that you've learned from that side?
Yeah, I think I do meditate regularly, but in short amounts.
Okay.
I actually have redefined what meditation means to make it much more accessible. It seems to be the scary thing that most people are afraid of.
Definitely.
But I think you can find a meditative state in anything you do.
Okay.
Including sitting on the bus and just looking out the window, appreciating all sorts of things and really embracing being present. And so I think my formal practice is probably not great, but my informal day-to-day practice is, I almost want it to be a default state. And I think I've been more conscious of trying to get to that, which has been great. In terms of, I grew up and have more so in the recent past embraced some philosophies of Jainism, which is a faith based from the Indus Valley. I think there's a reason why many leaders of US tech companies come from this region of the world. I think that Eastern Valley systems are incredible at embracing teams, having a focused vision, but giving space and empathy to others' views in a company or in a family. And Anekantavad, you mentioned, was probably a revelation for me when I first learned about it at 15 or 16. It seems an obvious concept in hindsight. It's just the appreciation that there are many ways to view reality and to have compassion and empathy from a view that may sound different from your own. And it actually was reflected in probably my favorite quote of all time by Charlie Munger, the late Charlie Munger, which is to never let yourself have conviction in an idea until you can argue the opposing claim better than anyone else can.
Right, okay.
So that was just such a profound, it sounds obvious, but when you are operating a company, for example, it gives you a precedence for listening to your colleagues and trying to appreciate their viewpoint. You still can make your own decision. It also, the other ideas I've really enjoyed studying are about what I call the four kashayas in Jainism, or the vices of human behavior. The two particular ones for running a business that I found useful are to do with dispelling the ego and your greed. And that's very important if you want to build a team where you want to hire someone that you know is better than you at something. And I think leaders can sometimes get egotistical about and greedy about owning the company and having credit. And relinquishing that was necessary in a place like Wayve, where honestly I probably felt like I was in the bottom quartile
Oh my gosh.
of intelligence in general, or at any particular task. And that is not easy for someone to do when they've been praised their whole life for being so good at everything. So these are all places where I think this philosophy was very valuable for.
Quickly interrupt, that kind of, in my head, that draws parallels to the meritocracy you were saying of a country where a leader shouldn't be afraid of having people on the same table who are much smarter than him or her, because it means that, together, if you're on the same team working towards the same goal, similar to in a company, if you're working towards the same goal, having someone smarter is actually a benefit rather than something you should be scared of.
Exactly, yes. And that makes sense if you are doing this for the benefit of all rather than yourself. And I think these principles have helped guide the kind of culture and philosophy I wanted to build in the company. And yeah, it manifested in many ways in Wayve, particularly one that I like to talk about is our lunch program. We started the company in a house and had a really wonderful kitchen and no real good options for lunch nearby, and decided, which was a bit controversial, to have a chef to make lunches.
Oh, wow.
And aside from the cost consideration, which was not massive in the grand scheme of things, the main reason for doing it was to encourage people to sit and eat together for 45 to 50 minutes almost every day. And the bonding that created was incredible and quite hard to really describe. If you think about a company like Wayve, which has many different skill sets within it, people who've come from the gaming industry who build simulators, people who've come from machine learning, people who are data engineers, even people who drive and operate the vehicles, they kind of speak slightly different languages.
Yeah.
And if their only interaction was in formal meetings, I think a lot would have been lost in translation.
Definitely.
So what this lunch created was an environment with no pressure to just get to learn their language. What do they care about? What is their family like? What do they do in their spare time? It sounds so trivial, but actually this created great cohesion in the company, catalyzed many more collaborations between varying teams, and the performance was just, I think, really good because of it. The retention was high, and I don't think we really believed that would be such a big factor, but that still exists to this day with so many people in the company. And so I think, again, this really came from a cultural upbringing of food sharing, which is very prevalent in my upbringing, and ways that I think this is the beauty of starting a company. You can really imbibe your personal life philosophy into an entity and let other people
let it grow,
enjoy it and embrace it.
Definitely.
And it's your way of projecting your vision of the world to this community. And I've never found, I haven't started my own family, but that's probably the only other place you can experiment with really living your true self via your work.
That sounds even more exciting than... I'm now really excited to start my own company, hopefully one day, because it feels like you can manifest your own kind of goals and mission with a team of people who have a similar idea, and just see how you can grow together. I wanted to ask, lastly, just on what you're doing. What's your plan now? So are you still working with CHARM Therapeutics? And I think you're an investor on the side. And if there's anything else you have going on.
Yeah, so I actually launched a micro VC fund, basically an angel fund, where I've done pre-seed investments in about 40 startups some of which have come from Imperial actually, mostly in applications of AI. This is now deployed, and I try to help the founders where I can, but this is kind of paused for now. And rather than do a second fund, I am thinking of getting going with a new startup. So that's brewing.
Always onto something else.
Yes, so maybe you'll hear more about that soon. Again, in a new area with people I'm really enjoying working with right now. So yeah, that's the setup. With CHARM, they're going through an exciting fundraise right now, but I'm not involved so much in the day-to-day. Just speaking with the CEO to help with that process. But I think I like this early phase of getting from 0 to 1.
Okay.
And
then kind of letting it go from 1 to whatever.
It seems like that's where I've ended up going.
Okay. Is there a reason why you prefer that kind of idea of really... The hardest part, I guess, is taking it from kind of an idea to a company.
Yeah, I think it's just that I'm greedy in wanting to try lots of different things. And one of the challenges with a startup is when you get deep into it, you have to shut everything else off, which is quite wonderful when you become potentially the best in the world at that one thing. But the world, for me anyway, the world is full of incredible things going on, and which changes every few years, it seems. And so I think the setup I found now, just seeing where the world is heading, and again trying to catch new waves every few years seems to be a fun thing to do whilst I still can.
And just on that point, so having sat on both sides of the table, you've been an investor and you've founded 2 companies. What have you learned from that idea of you've been a founder and you're now giving advice to new founders? What sort of advice do you give, like if you had to give like a key piece of advice to a new founder, because you've done that many times?
Yeah. So I think it's getting a startup correct is a mix of a few factors. An idea that you are passionate about, where the timing feels right, like why is now the right time to build something, I think is a much bigger factor than people give it credit. And with whom, like who you're doing this with. You can start a company on your own, but I just think it's infinitely better with ideally a partner or maybe 2 and a team. And just bear in mind you're going to be doing this, even if it's not forever. When you do it for 1 or 2 years at the beginning, it's going to feel like a lifetime. So you've got to really have this intrinsic motivation for the problem you work on. And so, yeah, those are the things I would try to get right. And then a lot is up to the universe, whether it can succeed or not. But those are probably the things you should, which are in your control, which are worth considering.
Perfect. So I just wanted to end on a few rapid fire questions, if that's okay. So the first one I just want to ask is, what's the best book you've read? Maybe in the recent times or in your last few years?
Yeah, gosh. The one I thought about recently, I don't know if it's the best, but the one that I think I garnered a lot about as both an entrepreneur but as a human, I really like the writings of Naval Ravikant. He has an almanac, which is essentially an amalgamation of his tweets, which shares his life philosophy on all sorts of things: wealth, family life, balance, innovation, building teams, working with people. I think for me, that's what I really like, and it's very palatable. It's an easy read over a weekend, with a lot of aphorisms and things you can live by. So that was great. Funnily enough, I also like Charlie's Almanac. As I've referenced multiple times, Charlie Munger, he had some incredible insights and wisdom. And what I really enjoyed about his approach, including Warren Buffett, is simplicity. Their ideas are actually really simple. They often argue that having high IQ is actually worse for their work.
Really?
Because you end up overthinking things.
Yeah.
So embracing simplicity. And kind of ironically, I just read the biography of Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson.
he also wrote Steve Jobs'
Yes, he did.
biography.
Mm-hmm. And in this one, again, it's often about simplification. Musk's approach to building things and making things cheaper in a counterintuitive way isn't about complicated get-arounds. It's really simplification. How can you simplify some piece of hardware to make it easier to make and cheaper? And so that's like a direction I've been embracing more and more. How do I simplify my whole life? And that's a theme that I'm interested in at the moment.
Okay, great. Second question is, I'm not sure if you believe in the idea of role models, but if you could sit down and have dinner with one person, whether it's in the past or in the present, who would that one person be?
I like the idea of learning from everyone, by the way, even people who I disagree with.
Okay.
As I mentioned, Adolf Hitler, I disagree with his philosophy, but he did something remarkable that you can learn from. But if I had to pick one, I think the person that has really blown my mind is probably Leonardo da Vinci.
Okay.
Because his interests spanned so many sectors.
Right.
Like he was, involved in dissecting dead bodies to understand how the body works.
Wow.
He built machines like helicopters and planes before anyone else had hypothesized them. He was an artist, a scientist, and just had this curiosity about the world in a sense that, well, in a way that we don't really embrace today because we specialize so early.
Right.
He was like the Renaissance man.
Uh-huh.
He also has a biography by Walter Isaacson, by the way, which I've read. And yeah, just his general curiosity and willingness to experiment across domains throughout his life with a relatively poor upbringing. He was a bastard. He wasn't acknowledged by his father. And so he ended up going to schooling which was potentially below what he would have achieved elsewhere. And he still managed to achieve so many great insights.
It sounds so much like you, in my opinion. Like you're trying to go to loads of different domains and really kind of experiment and see how your curiosity can take you from healthcare to, from autonomous cars and whatever's coming next. The last two actually I had was, do you have any hobbies that would surprise most people in your free time?
Well, yes, one probably lately, which kind of surprised me for people. I write haikus. I write poetry.
Oh my gosh! Wow. From maths at Cambridge to writing.
which is pretty strange. I've really enjoyed doing it. It came about just over a year ago when I was traveling. I really wanted to journal my travels, but I didn't have time when you're backpacking to sit every day and write, pages of prose about your thoughts and feelings and experiences. So what I found valuable instead was short, essentially poems about an experience I had, and I would do this all the time, whilst even in the middle of a hike or on a bus between towns, or even whilst, preparing a meal or whatever. And I think I liked the structure of them in that they have this syllable structure. They're short, so don't take a lot of time, and that you can quickly embed your sentiment in a few phrases. And yes, so I think since then I've written about 400, almost like one a day.
That's incredible.
Which I've enjoyed. I share some of them, but not that many. That's probably the most surprising. I'm still kind of shocked.
That is really surprising. That's really inspiring as well. I think you're consistent with it. I guess you improve over time just if you're consistent.
Perhaps, they're very subjective and personal. So, but it's just a fun process turning sentiments into short words, short phrases.
And the last rapid fire question was, what's the best piece of advice you've been given? So obviously you've given advice to many people, such as myself today, but what's the best you've received?
It's a hard question.
It's a tough question, yeah.
I think the one I would say, or let's say the idea I've tried to use the most is like a long-term regret minimization, which comes from, you've probably seen analysis of people who have spent time with people on their deathbeds and what do they regret in their life. And making decisions based on this, what do you think you would least regret?
Right.
What, like avoiding things you think you'd regret at that time, which is very hard to do because who knows what you may end up regretting. But you see patterns.
I see, yeah.
And almost always, nobody regrets having not worked enough. Most people regret things around not going on enough adventures, or not spending enough time with certain people in their lives, or pursuing certain challenging events. And so I think that regret minimization probably is what made me start Wayve, CHARM, and my next things. Maybe will get me into trouble once in a while, but I don't think I'll regret it, because like with SpaceX's rockets, you need a few things blowing up in your journey to achieve such big heights. I think it's a necessary part of the journey. So that's kind of the framework I think I most have enjoyed. It wasn't necessarily a piece of advice, but it's something I learned.
I really love that. Thank you so much for sharing. So I think that's a perfect place to end this podcast. Really, from the bottom of my heart, I really want to say thank you so much, because personally I've learned so much. I'm hoping the audience has also taken something away from today's podcast. You're a role model for me in terms of what you've managed to do, not only the companies you've created, but also the way you kind of think about these companies. So I really appreciate your time in coming here today, and I hope all our listeners can, see your next startup and hopefully learn something from that. And wishing you the best for your travels over the next few months.
Thank you very much for having me, and really enjoyed the conversation, and hope it was helpful to somebody.
Perfect. Thank you so much.